Welcome to Dispatch Live. I think we're live. We are being told we're live. Thanks so much for everyone who's here this week. I am Declan Garvey, editor of the Morning Dispatch, and we have making her Dispatch Live debut is Mary Trimble. I guess the newest Dispatch full-time staffer, but you've been around for a little while. So why don't you introduce yourself? Mary was an intern last summer who recently joined us full-time, and we're very excited to have her on the TMD team, but also at the company. So welcome everybody. And Mary, why don't you let us know a little bit about you?
Yeah, so I just graduated from the College of William and Mary. So go Tribe to anyone out there. I'm sure it's a fairly small number of William and Mary graduates who are big Dispatch listeners, but yeah, I just joined full-time at the beginning of this month. It's been a busy month to start full-time reporting work, but I have been working part-time for the Dispatch since January, so it's been already almost 6 months that I have been on the TMD team. So it's been a good 6 months. It's been a crazy last month. We had an indictment, an almost coup, big stuff. So excited for more, I guess.
Yes, and you are a Dispatch softball player, which our game this week was rained out. It's been raining for like 10 straight days here in DC, and if my internet goes out over the next hour, that's why. But hopefully it holds out here. We have another game on Thursday, so hopefully you will be hearing positive updates in Friday morning's newsletter. You do have at least one William and Mary fellow alum who's watching. She's on the other side of that door, but besides that, I can't speak for anybody besides her. So you mentioned all the things you've been covering. I think we want to drill down on one in particular tonight. That's what's been going on in Russia. Typically, we were talking about what's going on in Ukraine, but this is actually in Russia itself. Obviously, a very busy news weekend. We had big plans to cover certain things for Monday's newsletter, and then when did you get a message from me on?
Yeah, like 5 o'clock on Friday. No
Yes.
sooner had you said, barring any crazy news, then was there a
didn't knock on wood
political incident.
So yes, thank you for diving into it over the weekend. Kind of you'd been covering this guy whose name I will let you pronounce, but why don't you let viewers know kind of what the latest is? Well, start from the beginning. What the origins of this latest developments are, and then we can talk a little bit about what comes next.
Sure. So yeah, I'll set the stage a little bit with our good friend Evgeny Prigozhin, who is just like a straight up weird dude. He is a convict. He was in jail in the Soviet Union in the 80s for burglary. And then after he got out of jail, he went back to his native St. Petersburg, where he started a hot dog stand, which he parlayed into a restaurant, which is how he met none other than Vladimir Putin in the 90s in St. Petersburg. And from there, he has sort of created this business empire, which includes a catering business. So he became known as Putin's chef because he had so many catering deals with the Kremlin, as well as, starting in 2014, a private military company. So, you know, the catering to warlords.
Which one is the side hustle and which one's the main gig?
Yeah, I don't know. It's hard to say. It actually seems like he, according to disclosures from Putin himself today, like he makes about the same amount of money from both. So neither, I guess. They're both the main gig. Yeah, and so Wagner is the name of this private military company. It's not at all the only private military company in Russia. There are plenty of them, but because of Prigozhin's close relationship with Putin throughout the last 2-3 decades, it's by far the most successful. And it was mostly clandestine for the better part of the last decade. but it is now out in the open since the war in Ukraine started. And Prigozhin's mercenaries have been fighting the war in Ukraine in Bakhmut. It's been one of the sort of main wins that Russia could claim, was thanks to Prigozhin and Wagner. But despite that, Prigozhin has had some real critiques of the Ministry of Defense and how they are running the war. In February, he first accused the defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, of withholding ammunition from his men. There was some reporting from the Pentagon leaks earlier this year that maybe that was true. And then he accused them of the same thing again in May. And at that point, threatened to pull his troops out of Bakhmut. He kind of waffled, he went back and forth. There was, some negotiating maybe with the Ministry of Defense, and ultimately his troops remained in Bakhmut, and they retook the city after one of the longest battles of the war.
So this has been kind of portrayed, I think, by a lot of people as a coup against Putin, kind of fed up with his leadership, trying to end his reign in Russia. My understanding, and from your reporting, is that it's much less about Putin himself than it was this kind of troika of defense ministers, army leaders, and kind of a internal power struggle between the private military and the main Russian military, and who's getting which resources. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and I think it's he's been very critical of the Ministry of Defense, of the defense minister, of the chief of the general staff, Gerasimov, but he's mostly stayed away until recently from directly criticizing Putin. And so I think it would definitely, or if, at least from what we can confirm, it seems like it would be overstating it to say this was in any way an effort to topple Putin. But it was definitely an escalation of an ongoing conflict between the military top brass and Prigozhin and Wagner, who are, fairly well integrated, all things considered. It's sort of notional separation between the military proper and Wagner, but he is still a private military company doing the best job of fighting the war in Russia that Putin has.
Right, which is I think it plays into part of why he felt the need he wants to get a little bit more recognition for what he's been doing with his men versus a lot of the failures that I know he said something along the lines of, if the Russia had gone with the Wagner group from day one, this probably would have been over on day one.
Yeah, his words in translation were masterclass, that he taught a masterclass in invasion over the weekend.
That's I can't wait till we actually get that class on masterclass, that exactly, random service. You could do the catering stuff on one day and then kind of the warlord stuff on the next. So where he turned around on Saturday afternoon, everybody was preparing for kind of a very big explosive weekend where, the Putin regime seemed to be on really, really shaky ground. And then all of a sudden he turns around, says, we don't actually want anybody to die. We're not going to continue our path towards Moscow, even though there really wasn't that much resistance that they were being met with. And now he's in Belarus and probably has about 2 weeks to live. We'll see. Maybe Putin will be a man of his word and let him kind of live out his days in Belarus, which is not where we were talking in our editorial meeting yesterday. There are better places to be exiled to than Belarus, but
Napoleon had a better gig.
Yes. So what's kind of the latest that's come out? I know Putin spoke yesterday and then again this morning. What is he saying? What is Prigozhin saying, and kind of where do things lie now?
Yeah, so the first time we heard from Prigozhin after he launched this sort of mutiny was answered, at least to start, one of the big questions that we had, which was why do this? And so in his telling, it was because the Ministry of Defense on June 10th had threatened to bring all private military companies under their umbrella to make them sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. And Prigozhin said absolutely not. And then he escalated, basically potentially to trying to negotiate his way out of this by really sort of threatening them. And we heard from Putin today saying that this was sort of an averted civil war. When he first spoke over the weekend, he compared it to the events, the quote unquote intrigues of 1917, which may be understating the Russian Revolution just a little bit. And does that make him Nicholas II? I don't know if he likes that comparison. So now, yeah, as we said, Prigozhin is in Belarus, which was part of this agreement to turn the columns of advancing Wagner troops around. The Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, said, sort of negotiated this deal, which was Prigozhin gets to go to Belarus. Wagner men who participated in this mutiny won't be prosecuted. But there have been some mixed messages about sort of the future of Wagner itself. So on the one hand, you had the Russian Minister of Defense today or yesterday saying Wagner's work in Africa, most notably in Mali and in the Central African Republic, will continue. They provide security for these regimes. They fight terrorists, sort of shooting first and asking questions later, as well as against rebel groups in Africa. And so Lavrov said this will continue, but at the same time, in Russia, the Ministry of Defense is announcing that they're sort of potentially demilitarizing to a certain extent, turning in this heavy weaponry by July 1st, which was the original deadline for all of the private military companies to come under the Ministry of Defense umbrella. And yeah, as you said, this regime has a reputation for doing away with unfriendlies. And so, for now,
or the unfriendlies just have a reputation of falling out windows.
Tripping
the
out
causation
of windows
could go either direction. You never know.
Correlation is not causation here. Shouldn't overstate. But yeah, so I mean, Prigozhin is notionally alive. We think we last we heard from him this weekend, he was alive. Lukashenko said today that he had landed in Belarus, but we haven't gotten confirmation from Prigozhin himself of his whereabouts. So yeah, it remains to be seen if Putin will keep to his word, not prosecute him as he promised. The security services said they had closed that investigation. But I think there has been a lot of waffling from the Kremlin, maybe, the Kremlin itself, Putin himself, not really knowing what to do with this guy because he is so well integrated. He has served so many roles as sort of an arm of Kremlin foreign policy in various places. So yeah, it's difficult to know what will come next, but an interesting story to follow.
It has been, yes, and it will continue to be. Keep your eyes peeled for future Morning Dispatch items on it. We do have to move to our next segment soon, but I want to get in one question from the audience. And if anybody else has questions in the audience, feel free to send them in the chat, and Victoria on our team will send them to me. But from Charles, a question about the Wagner mercenaries. If they are if they do end up joining Russian forces, they consolidate the military. Is there a chance that they just leave when they realize the pay isn't there? What have you seen or heard about kind of the morale of the Wagner mercenaries? Were they behind Prigozhin on this? Kind of how was it divided?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I think Lukashenko actually said in his comments this morning, that he pitched killing Prigozhin to Putin and then was like, wait, maybe we shouldn't do that because Prigozhin's men actually like him a lot. And so there was this fear that they would continue on anyway, this time emboldened because they had sort of martyred Prigozhin. Also, a lot of these guys are former military anyway. So, they left the Russian military in a lot of cases and decided that Wagner was the better gig. So, if they do go back, yeah, it's perfectly, it's reasonable to expect that they might not like that gig as much as the Wagner gig. But at the same time, a lot of the role that Wagner was playing in Bakhmut was, effectively cannon fire. They were in cannon fodder. They were in one of the most brutal battles in Ukraine. So, yeah, it's hard to know sort of to a man what will happen, but a lot of these guys, there's a reason they're not in the Russian military anyway.
Yeah. Well, on that, thank you very much for joining us, and nice job on your first ever Dispatch Live. There will be plenty more to come, I'm sure. Enjoy the rest of your night, and then we will be joined by Grayson. There, look at that transition. You guys should have been around for when we first started Dispatch Live and kind of the tech behind that. I think probably 1 out of every 3 times we tried to do a Dispatch Live, we actually did a full hour of Dispatch Live. The OG viewers remember, I'm sure, but thank you for sticking with us. We've got quite the operation now, and Grayson, welcome. Good to have the New York contingent represented. Is it raining where you are too?
Not yet. I think it's somehow later in the week. Normally DC weather comes like after New York weather, but yeah. I think it's the inverse this week.
And then I was talking to family back home in Chicago, the smoke and the haze that when last time we were on Dispatch Live, you were talking about in New York has now migrated to the Midwest and is making it very difficult to breathe in Chicago. So we have the Canadian wildfires to thank for that still.
I will note in the great rivalry of number one things between Chicago and New York, I think their air quality was somewhere below 200 on the scale, and New York was well above 300. So still number one there.
Congratulations. Yes, that's maybe that's why the taste buds are so off and you guys like that pizza that you guys have. So we've got a couple different things to talk about these next 15 minutes here. And again, Dispatch viewers, feel free to send your questions in the chat, and we'll be joined by David Drucker at I always want to bottom of the hour. I think that is the correct. Nobody uses analog clocks anymore, but bottom of the hour, David will join us to talk through 2024 candidates and campaigns. But I want to check in on a story we talked about a couple weeks ago here. You've been following this PGA LIV Golf merger. Now it's kind of turned into a will they, won't they story. A couple more details have come out since the initial reporting a couple weeks ago. So why don't you get viewers up to speed on kind of the latest there and whether or not this is actually going to go through?
Yeah, it's not looking too hot for this deal, basically. So a couple weeks ago, it was announced, and there really isn't that many allies for it. Congress is, by and large, people who are commenting on it have come out against it. There's been 2 separate congressional investigations launched into the deal, one by Senator Blumenthal, one by Senator Wyden, kind of through their respective committee leaderships. There's been reported that the Department of Justice has informed both LIV and PGA Tour that they are reviewing the deal. And there was, I think, Representative Maxine Waters and Senator Sherrod Brown also sent a letter to the Treasury Department asking the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States to review the deal for national security concerns. So not exactly a warm welcome for this news. In my reporting on it, I think the biggest factor that will likely or could likely sink the deal is the antitrust concerns. So basically you had one golf league in the world, PGA Tour. There's other leagues, but the dominant kind of pinnacle of the sport. And then you had a rival league challenging that. And now they're merging, and in a sense, to kind of take away the competition, which is basically, I mean, it's simplification, like a classic antitrust issue. You're going from two entities in the space to one, and the Federal Trade Commission, the Department of Justice often challenge mergers that would go from 4 to 3 or 3 to 2. So a 2 to 1 is highly unlikely just on that kind of overall level to get a stamp of approval from the Department of Justice. It's not looking good basically for the outlook on this deal. And there aren't really that many finalized deals, even in the 2 weeks since this announcement. There still isn't a finalized structure for the deal. There still isn't valuations for the assets between the two companies, which is a key part of completing a merger. The New York Times obtained like a copy of the framework agreement yesterday between these two entities, which basically had the same types of details, limited details that they had in the press release last week. So it's certainly an uncertain road ahead for the world of golf, and I think there's going to be more drama.
And if it does get resolved, either way, it seems like this is going to be months down the road, even potentially years. We're not going to get a combined entity anytime soon, at least not as soon as people were hoping when they announced this deal initially a couple weeks ago. It might have been even last month at this point. But yeah, so that will be an interesting story to follow. We'll have you on it. You are the official Dispatch golf correspondent. I didn't know if you knew you were going to take that role when you joined us a couple months ago, but we needed one, and you'd watched what was the Netflix Full Swing?
Full Swing, which
yes.
I mentioned this in the piece that I wrote, but it's a great time to be a producer on that show. The executive producer Chad Mumm has just been having a great couple weeks of cameras rolling and capturing all the candid reaction to this news. So I'm excited for season 2.
Yes, we do have one question from Melissa, and this was actually one that I was thinking as well, as you were talking there, on the antitrust concerns you mentioned going from 2 to 1. It definitely makes sense the way that that would lessen competition. Theoretically, LIV is only 2 or 3 years old, so it's kind of like it's going from 1 to 2 back to 1 in a sense. So is there any way that could be kind of like a pretense of, we don't want this to go through, so we're going to find a way to make it not go through, and this happens to be the easiest lever at hand? Or kind of, what do you think about that concern?
Yeah, no, it's certainly a valid point. And there's some historic kind of antitrust investigations in the PGA Tour that were resolved under kind of arguably more political than adhering strictly to antitrust law circumstances in the past. And there are some recent investigations that have been kind of ongoing in the PGA Tour before this whole mess erupted. But an argument basically that the PGA Tour could use potentially in response to this is that they exist in a natural monopoly, that their market for professional golf, basically it only works for there to be one dominant league from the economics of it. And the fact that LIV entered successfully into that market, was able to pry a bunch of PGA Tour players to come play for their league, kind of makes that a very implausible argument, because you did have a full year or so, and honestly continuing, even though this deal's been announced, it hasn't been finalized, you still have viable competition between those two leagues. So even if that argument might have made some sense in theory, the facts on the ground make it a whole lot harder for the PGA Tour to argue that going forward.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. We have a couple minutes left here before Drucker joins us. So reminder, any questions that you have about LIV and golf, or about anything under the sun, we are here to answer them. But I want to turn a little bit to a topic that was discussed last week in a little bit of a different light on Dispatch Live, which was Hunter Biden's agreement to plead guilty to a handful of misdemeanor tax charges, and a pretrial diversion agreement on a gun charge had just come out right before Dispatch Live. A week later, we now have some allegations coming from 2 whistleblowers at the IRS that investigation was not undertaken necessarily with the most impartial of care at the top level. So specific allegations that that investigators were prohibited from pursuing leads that they thought were necessary, or an allegation that a DOJ official tipped off Hunter Biden's legal team that a search or a raid was imminent, allowing him to kind of move some papers around if he wanted to before investigators reached them. And then we have kind of this bombshell text message that's been kind of making the rounds that is from July 30th, 2017. So this is after Hunter's dad has left the vice presidency and before he's launched his presidential campaign, but Hunter sending a message to a Chinese businessman saying, essentially, where's my money? I have my dad sitting here right next to me, and we're both demanding to know where the money is. This obviously flies in the face of everything that Joe Biden has said about never speaking to his son about his business deals, kind of isolating that aspect of the family business from his political career and his political ambitions. It's not just Hunter, it's Joe's brother Jim as well is involved in a lot of these things. The story seems like it's not going away anytime before the 2024 election, probably only going to ramp up. House Republicans have vowed to continue investigations if and where the Biden or the Justice Department has not. What do you make of kind of these latest rounds of allegations? And I should say also that Attorney General Merrick Garland has come out and basically said none of this is true. Said that they handed the investigation off to a Trump-appointed U.S. attorney in Delaware who basically gave him full reign to do whatever he wants. That U.S. attorney has sent a letter to Congress saying, yep, they let me do whatever I want, and this is what I want to do. So it's kind of a he said on this story so far, and there's going to be a lot more shoes to drop, but it's going to be an issue for President Biden as he mounts his re-elect.
Yeah, I think in the lead up to hearing the actual substance of these allegations from the IRS whistleblowers, because you had the one from a few months ago, kind of came out through his lawyer, and then we've actually gotten the goods, so to speak, here. It's like a 200 plus page long document from the House Ways and Means Committee of all these transcripts. And you and I both talked with some sources and former federal prosecutors who've mentioned to us that it's not uncommon for there to be tensions between agents, either in the FBI or in the IRS, investigating a case, thinking that they have a lot of evidence to actually prove something, and that you could kind of throw the book at a person you're investigating, and then the prosecutors are kind of like, well, no, I can't actually prove that in court. The stuff that's laid out in this document certainly goes far beyond, at least in my mind, just the typical agency tensions that you would see there between the prosecutor and the agents. And obviously, as you said, there's lots of conflicting stories here. Like none of this has been confirmed or validated beyond the transcripts themselves, but there's some pretty stark contradictions. It's not just like an investigator saying, I think like political influence is happening here. It's one of the witnesses saying that, oh, here are my notes from the meeting where the attorney investigating Hunter Biden, David Weiss, said that he was blocked or basically hampered by other people in the Department of Justice, or that he was denied special counsel status. So I'm really interested to see, like, as this progresses, how those specific claims in particular, in addition to kind of the bombshell text that you highlighted, how those are borne out. Like, how does Weiss or Garland or other people at DOJ substantiate the kind of stark contradictions between what they've been saying and what the whistleblowers have been saying?
And what I find particularly interesting about this moment of the kind of the scandal is it's breaking into the mainstream. It's not just being covered on Fox. It's not just being covered, in some of these outlets that are focused primarily on stories and dirt on Democrats, Biden, what have you. There was a really striking White House press briefing on Friday where just reporter after reporter after reporter after reporter from New York Times, ABC, CNN, basically saying, are you going to respond to these allegations? Can you give us anything on these allegations? This is a big deal. Why aren't you saying anything? And the press secretary just basically trying to shut it down, move on to the next reporter, and then the next reporter just picks up the same line of questioning. And you see the Biden administration and Democrats have been used to being able to kind of just brush some of these allegations under the rug over the past couple of years. And for the most part, it's worked. Obviously, we have those outlets, Fox and some of those others that have been continuing to dig and unearth more and more and more. But I don't think that that's going to necessarily work this time. They might have to have a renewed playbook, because these allegations are, as you mentioned, striking, and if proven out, are certainly worthy of discussion, if not more than that. So Grayson, thank you so much for being here with us. We think we have Drucker in the chat, but if we don't, I'll let you respond to that.
No, I'll just add one comment. Just that I think that the strategy from the Biden administration has kind of evolved from saying that Joe Biden loves his son and he's done nothing wrong, to what I think Democrats and certainly the White House had hoped with this plea agreement was, okay, he's gotten some accountability, he's facing the music, we can put this under the rug. And that might well be the case next month if this is signed off on and the legal troubles are gone, at least for the tax issues and the gun charges. But this is kind of blown up from the political perspective. So the legal woes could be winding down, but the political issues for Biden in 2024 related to this kind of drag are still ramping up.
What a transition to 2024. As we have before you leave, Grayson, we have one question from a viewer on what you're drinking. So thank you for that. This is Palinkovac, which is a Croatian liqueur. It's kind of like Amaro, but it's made from wormwood and very strong, but very sweet also. So it's a good little after dinner sipper. That's probably the first. What did you say it was called? Palinkovac. Probably the first Palinkovac on Dispatch Live. So that's a big moment for the company right there. Grayson, thank you for being with us, and I'll talk to you in Slack in probably a couple minutes here. Yeah. Thanks, guys. See you. Drucker, how's it going?
Well, I mean, I don't have Palinkovac, but
we'll come back next week and everybody will have it.
But I made it. I'm impressed. Yeah. Grayson, and now I'm going to have to search the back of the cabinet to try and compete with that.
Do you have anything with you right now?
Tonight, a picture of perfect health. It's filtered water.
Congratulations. Yes. So usually when I'm checking in with you, you've come back from traveling somewhere, getting out on the road on the campaign trail. Have you been in DC lately?
This time you're getting me right before I head back out, more or less. We'll be in Michigan for the 4th of July, my wife and my youngest son and I, and then I'm headed to New Hampshire next week to see what I can figure out about what's going on out there. I feel like a lot of June, if you look at the schedule from the candidates, and this is true for every candidate, but Ron DeSantis in particular, a lot of these candidates were focused on fundraising. The end of the second quarter is Friday. That's a really big deal for a lot of candidates. We're going to find out how viable their campaigns are, if they're going to make it through the summer without having to make any major adjustments. Obviously, we have that first debate in Milwaukee coming up August 23rd. Trump is interesting in that he doesn't go out too often. He hasn't really done many rallies. He's doing a lot of the normal events that normal candidates do. He's in New Hampshire this week. He did a Republican women's event. There was a dust up with DeSantis because he decided to crash the party by doing his own event on the same day. And it was a town hall, by the way. He got a lot of criticism the last time he was there, his first time there. Why won't you do a town hall, talk to voters? So today it was town hall day for him. So it's been an interesting month watching some of these candidates realize maybe they should try and compete with the front runner rather than the guy in second place or third place. But also a lot of fundraising and just a lot of focus on putting together the support they need to get on that debate stage per the Republican National Committee established thresholds.
As somebody who is signed up for all of those fundraising emails just to kind of for reporting purposes, see what's in them. They have been increasingly frantic the past couple days.
Right. You know how you get them and they're like, oh my God, I'm about to lose. You must give me money. And you see them on the campaign trail. By the way, they sign their name to these things. They don't write them.
Yeah.
It's like, it's bizarro world. Because like, how's it going? Oh, everything's great. Everything's wonderful. We're building support. Long way to go. We're fine. Everything's great. Fundraising email. I'm going to have to drop out tomorrow if you don't send me a quarter.
Yes.
Quick, David, join the list. Here's your, I don't know if I've seen any 300,000% match promises yet, but
it must work because they keep doing it. But it strikes me as so insulting to like the intelligence
it's all clickbait, man. You got to get them. You got to get people. If you first of all, if you believe in a candidate, then and as a voter, maybe you want this person to be president or be competitive. I suppose I'm not one of those people, right? Because I'm just looking for dirt. I'm a political reporter. I don't care who wins or loses. I mean, privately, I care, but I don't really care. So you're not going to get me with that. But I suppose if you care about somebody being in the race and be like, oh my God, they're going to drop out tomorrow without my $3. I don't need to go to Starbucks. Here, $3.
It does work. It does work. You mentioned DeSantis did his first town hall in New Hampshire today. We were talking in Slack earlier about one answer of his in particular. I think he was asked by a high school student there his thoughts on January 6th. And this was kind of the first time that I've seen, at least, that he was kind of put on the spot, having to give an answer to that, where he couldn't kind of either walk away or weasel out of it. And he said something interesting. It's about as far as you're going to see somebody who wants Trump's voters' support go on that day. But essentially, if we want to win in 2024, we need to be focused on the future, not the past. I wasn't anywhere near the Capitol that day, and I think the quote was like, I didn't enjoy what I saw that day. What do you make of that? Is that going to be a sustainable answer for him going forward?
Well, first of all, that's the great thing about New Hampshire and town halls is you can't scream at the questioner for being a part of the liberal corporate media. Although that's, it's really fruitful for a Republican candidate to be able to do that when it is one of us, and we're after them. But, I thought that answer was just fine. Was it an answer some of us would prefer? Some of us out in the world might prefer the answer that Chris Christie would give or Liz Cheney would give, or, that my mother would give, for those of us who watched that day, who covered that day, who care about the country, watching the U.S. Capitol be overrun by a bunch of people who, were led to believe the election was stolen and wanted to take matters into their own hands, was not a good day. But you're a Republican presidential candidate competing for a range of voters. And if you live in the past, particularly on topics that Republican voters in the primary states that are going to show up are not all that interested in relitigating, it can be problematic. Now, that doesn't account for the cognitive dissonance that seems to exist when it comes to Donald Trump, because the former president's the out and out front runner in this race, and all he does is live in the past when it comes to 2020 and January 6th and the last election and every other grievance he has. So it doesn't make perfect sense. But when I saw and when I watched the governor's full answer there, the student asked the question. I think he actually said he'd come over from a boarding school in Vermont to participate in the town hall, because he had asked him, hey, where do you go to school? What are you about? And he told him, and he didn't make any snide remarks. And then he just said, hey, listen, I kind of took it like this, like, yeah, that was bad. And by the way, I had nothing to do with that. It wasn't good, but I want to focus on the future. I think that's what a lot of Republican voters want to hear. And I think over time, by the way, if you believe like me, and there's only not many of me, at least based on our Slack channel, which I think if we sold subscriptions to, Like we could make a lot of money because it's actually what Twitter used to be, only better. I really think that there's a lot of action going on in the early primary states where the candidates are campaigning. And I think while it's hardly impossible that Trump will maintain his lead and just run the table. I mean, he is a strong front runner. I do think there are a lot of Republican voters that are looking around, and as time goes on and more of them start to tune in, the same way we have seen in past primaries, late breaking candidates and late breaking developments, or slowly breaking candidates and slowly breaking developments, you could see this thing become a lot more competitive than it appears to be today. I like to remind people, Donald Trump, who won the nomination in 2016, was winning in almost every poll, including in Iowa, until he didn't win Iowa. And in 2012, in that primary, when Mitt Romney ultimately won the nomination, everybody was wondering what the heck Rick Santorum was doing in the race. Here's a senator who was blown out, lost re-election in 2006, and dares to run for president. And about 10 days out, 15 days out, within the last month before the caucuses, which came early that year because there was this big competition about who was going to go first and when they were going to go, all of a sudden, he shoots up in the polls. And as it turned out, even though it didn't help him much, he actually won the Iowa caucuses. It's just they didn't count right and figure it out until it was too late to help him. My point being is that everybody looks at polling now and thinks, oh, yeah, this thing's done. I just don't think it's done. And I think over time, Republicans who are positioned to be competitive and could win, focusing on the future, acknowledging some of the things that happened before, and then pivoting to a focus on the future, I think could pay a lot of dividends.
That tees us up well for a question from Mark about Nevada as a potential early state. But I wanted to quickly get to a question from Ron first, just asking how many dollars raised are needed to get on the debate stage. David, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not a dollar amount. It's the number of individual donors at 40,000, along with some
Correct.
polling thresholds.
So by the way, I still happen to have this up because it's something I was looking at the other day. So I'm going to read this here from the RNC's website. Poll at least 1% in 3 national polls, or 1% in 2 national polls, and 1% in 1 early state poll from 2 separate carve-out states, which are the 4 early states that are recognized. And there's some other metrics there about, what makes the poll legitimate. Also, on the fundraising side, you must have a minimum of 40,000 unique donors, with at least 200 unique donors per state or territory in at least 20 states and territories. In other words, if all of your donors come from 1 state, not good enough. If they only come from 5 or 10 states, not good enough. So you need those 40,000 as a threshold, but you need to have at least 200 each in 20 different states or U.S. territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, etc.
It would be an interesting question for Sarah if she was on as the former political operative, but just I'm sure these campaigns, especially the ones that are kind of on the periphery, trying to get on that debate stage, Chris Christie, Will Hurd, some of these smaller, lesser known candidates are polling less. You're probably spending more money to get donors than you are actually bringing in donations, because it's more, I will pay you $3 if you donate $1 to me, because I just need that number. I don't necessarily need the money.
Correct. So the candidates that came into this campaign with an existing email list are in a much better position. I mean, never mind, obviously, if you're a known candidate, if you begin with a wealth of support or some breadth of support, you're going to have, it's going to be easier to get there. But if you're relevant and you have a political operation, you've been building this list for at least a year, maybe a few years. So you already have the list, and you don't have to invest as much to get as much. By the way, one last thing on those requirements for the debate, you're supposed to sign a pledge that says that you will support the Republican nominee no matter who it is. And Will Hurd, obvious long shot candidate, big underdog, already said he won't sign. So he doesn't get on the debate stage. Chris Christie, of course, says he's not going to support Trump no matter what, but that he will sign the pledge, but treat it about as seriously as Trump would treat the pledge, which, I mean, it's not a bad answer.
Yeah.
Because I guess Trump will sign it, and everybody knows that Trump doesn't keep any commitment he doesn't want to keep.
Right. Right. Yeah. The purpose of that pledge seems to have been flipped from 2016, where there it was trying to box Trump into supporting somebody else who eventually won, and now it seems to be to box people in to support Trump if and when he wins. The question that I teed up earlier from Mark on Nevada, question about why candidates so far are not there all that often. I know we're more than a year or almost a year away still from the primaries there, but I think according to Mark, it's only been DeSantis who goes to Adam Laxalt's event in the state. Do you think that that's going to start teeing up, or are people kind of ceding that state to Trump?
Good question. I don't think we have an answer yet. I mean, first of all, Nevada votes 4th on the Republican calendar, right? So these other states are easier to get to. They're still like Iowa, New Hampshire, South Carolina. Voters there are still more participatory, more dialed in when it comes to early state primary politics than Nevada. Nevada is this western state where you can spend all of your time in Las Vegas or Reno. There are some communities in between that do have votes that you want to get, but it's just it's more expensive to fly all the way out there. First of all, it's harder to get media coverage out there, and you have to work harder. It is a very Trumpy state when it comes to where the Republican base is out there, generally speaking. I mean, I know in 2016, at least it was, I remember covering the caucuses in 2016 in Nevada and talking to a Republican operative who told me that all of Trump's support out there was organic, that he didn't really do much other than some rallies. And you would talk to voters and they'd say, like, were you approached? Was there a door knock, phone call? And it was like, no, I was just interested in Trump and decided to vote for him. Obviously, we're long past that. But I think Trump starts out with an advantage. But I think the other thing, Declan, is that Iowa votes first, New Hampshire votes second. You can't put all your eggs in Nevada, because if you don't do well in one of the first 3, you're not going to have the momentum to do anything in Nevada. So you really need one of the first 3, if not 2 of the first 3, to make all of that matter, to make Nevada matter.
Right. Right. Well, shifting gears a little bit to something that happened today. You were covering Nikki Haley's speech at the American Enterprise Institute on nominally on China and her approach to China, but really as a way to kind of contrast herself with some of the other contenders in the race. And she really ended up going after her former boss pretty hard on his approach to China. So what did she say there, and what do you think it signals about the way she wants to run the rest of the race?
Yeah, it's really interesting. She didn't mention any of her Republican opponents other than Trump, right? And she could have. I mean, she could have talked about any Republicans' China policy as either being inadequate, or what have you had to say about it, or you need to focus on it more. She talked about 2 politicians in that speech and in a subsequent question and answer session. Donald Trump and Joe Biden. And she said she gave Donald Trump credit for changing how Americans in both parties and politicians in both parties look at China. Obviously, going back to Richard Nixon, they were an ally, and it was bipartisan policy in Washington to bring China along with the West in the hopes that China would turn out to be more like us, that as they got wealthier, their citizens would demand more freedom, more openness, and the Chinese dictatorship would slowly devolve into somewhat of a more liberal-oriented government, creating a more liberal-oriented society. We know it didn't happen. So she credits Trump for recognizing that things weren't working and getting people to look at things differently. And she said that he did a decent job with trade, but said that he was only focused on trade and ignored a number of other threats that China poses militarily, geopolitically, diplomatically, economically, and even said his trade policy, ultimately the way he handled trade with China was inadequate. And then he said and this was her quote, that he showed more, quote, moral weakness, unquote. That he shouldn't have been congratulating Xi Jinping and bragging about how we're good buddies and congratulating Xi Jinping on it was the 70th anniversary of the communist takeover of China. It just really took him to task. I mean, just beat the heck out of him. So to me, politically, it was interesting because this is something she had resisted for months, really just taking after Trump unequivocally on anything. So here she is setting up a contrast between herself and the front runner, which I think is important if you're going to get ahead in this race. But it showed that, to me, that this was a sort of a new stage in her campaign. That's what I think, but we'll have to see what things look like next week. The other thing that I thought was interesting is her speech, whether you agree with her or disagree with her, was detailed and expansive and thorough. I mean, she had a number of proposals in how she thinks the U.S. needs to deal with China, to confront the China threat, deal with Taiwan, and things like that. And it was a real sharp contrast to her, quote unquote, major speech on abortion in the Washington area back at the end of April, where she, major speech, come listen. And then it's like, oh no, we just need to forge consensus. Well, what do you think policy should be? Oh no, I'm not going to tell you. We need consensus around what? Well, around what we can agree on. Well, what can we agree on? Well, who knows? So here she is, very specific.
Yeah.
She's taking the front runner to task. And look, and she laid into Joe Biden. She gave her grievances with Joe Biden's China policy, and there are many grievances to have, depending on how you look at it. She gave that more airtime than she gave Trump. It's just that the Trump part was so unexpected if you've been following her campaign. During the question and answer session, I asked her if the U.S. should get rid of the one China policy and recognize Taiwanese independence. And she said no. She said that's not something Taiwan's asking for. It's something we should consider if they ever ask for it. I also asked her, because she had mentioned in her speech that the Chinese, of course, have set up some sort of spy station in Cuba. And so I said, well, you're president in January 2025. What do you do about it? And she kept saying it needed to be dismantled. So I said very politely, what do you do about it? And she finally said, if we need to sever all trade relations with China and decouple our economies completely, then that's what we should do. She thinks that would have an impact because the Chinese, she believes, need us more than we need them from an economic standpoint. So at least she ended up with an answer. It reminded me of when Chris Christie came and visited the dispatch offices recently here in DC. And I asked him, what would you do about Cuba and the Chinese state? And at first he was like, well, and this and that. And then finally his answer was, well, fine, we'll tell them we're going to put up a big spy station in Taiwan. See how you like that. So it's interesting to watch. I'm not being critical here. It's natural for presidential candidates to criticize the incumbent that they hope to beat and talk about how everything's going to be different once they're president, because, I'm not going to allow all these things to happen. Well, every single president inherits a whole host of problems. It doesn't matter who you are, who was president before. You just inherit stuff because the government continues to exist and somebody leaves and you take over. Well, what would you do about stuff that exists? You can talk all day long about how you're not going to get us into that thing or that problem or that trouble. But what about the troubles that already exist? What do you do? And I like to press them on that. And her answer was interesting, I thought.
That is the challenge of being a reporter, is to get people off of there. Everybody has like that first layer answer that they're going to give if they're asked about something. And then to get them past that and give you the actual answer or something new or something substantive is it's easier with some politicians than others, but you can get there with most of them if you take the right approach. So I want to wrap up. Kind of, we just have a couple minutes left here to kind of circle back to something that you said at the beginning of this conversation about how June is kind of like a loading month, or kind of a preparation month for, there's been a lot of talk about how Republican candidates haven't been going after Trump, with some very notable exceptions. But we're also what, 9 months, 8 months away still from the first votes being cast in the race. So are we starting to see with Nikki Haley today, with more and more people at least hinting that they're open to criticizing Trump on the document stuff as more evidence is released on that front? Are we starting to see kind of, all right, I've entered the race, I've laid out my own proactive message, now I'm going to need to respond to the front runner and make a name for myself that way? Do you expect to see this shifting before the debate? Are we going to wait until the debate to kind of kick this into the next gear?
So there are two questions there. Are they going after the front runner, and are they going after the front runner regarding his alleged mishandling of classified documents related to the federal indictment? So one thing I saw in June was more candidates specifically going after the front runner. I mean, Mike Pence enters the race June 7th, I believe. Immediately in his announcement speech, criticizes his former running mate, as he likes to say, and has kept it up since. Ron DeSantis enters the race in late May, and once he hit the campaign trail, did not hesitate to criticize his one-time key endorsement giver, and that hasn't stopped. Chris Christie, of course, is Chris Christie, and so he's been after it. And today we saw Haley. We haven't really seen much from Tim Scott. And of course, Vivek Ramaswamy is Donald Trump's biggest booster in the race, other than Donald Trump. But all in all, much more. We're in a race now. We're watching a race that seems like much more of a race. Like he's in front, and they all want to be him, and so they're attacking him, which kind of makes sense because that's what he does. And so we're seeing that now on the documents. It's much different. On the documents, a lot of Republicans really don't want to touch that, right? Other than to say that the feds are treating Republicans unfairly. I'm going to fix all of this. Donald Trump, is getting railroaded, and it's not right. They don't want to spend too much time saying that. That's generally what they've said on the documents. There have been some exceptions. Chris Christie, once again, being Chris Christie, but also Mike Pence, who has said, yeah, I don't know if I'd pardon this guy. What he's done is bad, and I can't defend it. And even if the Justice Department is being unfair, and I think they are, and I was there, and I know they've been unfair, it's not right. I can't defend what the guy's done. And we've seen more Republicans sort of get into that space where, well, I can't defend what he's done, and what he's done is pretty serious. But the Justice Department is still pretty bad. But nobody has really laid into him and just said, I mean, come on, man, this is awful, irresponsible, ridiculous, except for Chris Christie, and maybe a couple of others, but of notable candidates that can drive news and have an impact. Even if Chris Christie never does better than the 7% he is in New Hampshire, that guy can drive news, get headlines, and get people talking about stuff. Even if it's like, oh yeah, I'm not voting for him, but oh my God, did you hear about that? And did you hear what he said? I mean, he can do that. Where I don't know yet if somebody like Will Hurd, who's been critical of the former president on this, or Asa Hutchinson, who's been critical of the former president, I don't know if they can do that. He can. And so of the candidates of note besides him, I mean, the guy who's been the most critical has been Mike Pence, who's just like, this is indefensible. I found out I had classified documents. I called the feds in. I immediately gave it back. I mean, this is horrible. You can't do that. Even though, of course, I need to clean up the Justice Department and fix everything. And we need to, have a balanced justice system again, because, it's not fair what's going on here. So that's where that is. But I think the closer, the deeper we get into this, I think the more, I don't think this race is going to look like it did in March and April and early May. I think it's going to look a lot more like it looked in June, only more so as time goes on.
Yeah. Well, I don't like to pay a ton of attention to national polls, let alone national polls this far out. But from April to, I think, this weekend, Chris Christie has increased his support 500% in the NBC tracking poll. Granted, it's from like 0.8% to 4 point something percent, but maybe that can get some other candidates realizing that there is a way to break through. And that is a little bit more of an optimistic note to end on. But thank you everybody for joining us. I did not get final confirmation, but I think and assume there probably will not be a Dispatch Live next week, given that it is the 4th of July, and you should be watching fireworks and not us. So if that changes, you'll hear, but otherwise enjoy the holiday, and we will be back in a couple weeks.